The beginning of our school year this year coincides roughly with the beginning of Chodesh Elul, and that is the time when we work hard to bring God back into the center of our lives as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah. This seems to be a good opportunity to introduce our theme for this year at SAR High School, Avodat Hashem, which can help us, guide us in this process as we work towards the Yamim Noraim. Now, we generally assume that the term Avodat Hashem has one meaning, and we know what it is. It means to worship God or to serve God. And when we look around us or we look at ourselves, we say some people do it well, some people less so, some people work at it, some people don't. What I'd like to do is take a few moments to turn that concept around just a bit. And I'd like to do that by way of an example from another arena entirely. A number of years back, I read a book by Eric Foner, who is a professor at Columbia University. He wrote a book called The Story of American Freedom. And in that book, he describes freedom in America as what he called an essentially contested concept. It is essential, which means it is important to every American, freedom, and it's contested. It means that people fight about what it is. And what he says is that in certain societies, in every society, there are certain concepts that are central to that community. And because it's so important, people fight as to exactly how to fulfill or bring that idea to reality. In America, he says, you can't be an American if you don't believe in freedom. But what exactly freedom means, that's changed over the course of centuries. Some different people have had the opportunity to reap the benefits of freedom over the course of American history, and that's been fought about very seriously over the course of the years. So I'd like to suggest that Avodat Hashem is just such a concept. It's not necessarily an idea with one meaning, but rather it's an essentially contested concept. That means that to be a Jew, you have to believe that Avodat Hashem is central, that our job is to serve God. We can argue about what that means and follow different ways of expressing that, but it has to be part of our lives, the way that we live our lives. Now, once we think about Avodat Hashem in that way, it opens up possibilities, because rather than just saying, I do it or I don't, you look back and say, well, what are the ways in which that idea has been conceptualized? What does it mean actually to serve God? And what I'd like to do is to take a couple of minutes to share what is truthfully a little bit of an oversimplified taxonomy, meaning I'm going to set out a couple of options as to how to understand this concept. And it's simplifying it a bit, but I think that can be useful and constructive. I think that a lot of the ways of thinking about what it means to be Oved Hashem can fit into one of the following three options. Option number one, which I take from Rabbeinu Yonah, amongst others, is to simply translate the term as follows. You think of the word. What does it mean to be an Oved Hashem? Well, it comes from to be an Eved. An Eved is a servant. So to be an Oved Hashem means to live our lives as servants of God. Avodat Hashem is actually about submitting our will to the will of God. We are His servants and we follow His commandments. We exhibit our greatest commitment when we reject our own will in the desire to serve Hashem. In this understanding, how do I know when I'm really being Oved Hashem? Well, to a certain extent, when my will, if I want to do one thing and I do something else because God told me to, that's the real test. And if I want to all the time, then that's me, but that's not necessarily me being a servant. So in this formulation, the idea of being an Eved is focused on performing God's will, and the way that I do that is by submitting my will to God's. Option number two, to serve God best, we try to minimize our contact with material things and maximize our contact with the spiritual. We might try to spoil our physical selves less and engage our spiritual side more through song or prayer or nature or something like that. That means in this version, and this is an idea that the Ramchal develops a lot, we're made up of two sides. We have a physical side and a spiritual side. Our goal is to downplay some of the physical attractions that we have and try to establish relationship and connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. While the first approach asks that we submit ourselves to God, this approach asks that we negate one side of ourselves, our physical selves, in order to cultivate the other, the spiritual, to establish a connection with God. And therefore, it's not about submission, it's actually about relationship. The goal is for us to be able to develop a space through which we establish the strongest connection to the spiritual side of ourselves and lower a little bit the physical side of our beings. For others, the Rambam chief among them, our goal is not to negate the self, nor is it to connect to that which is beyond us. An Oved Hashem is one who constantly directs the self towards creating a godly world in the here and now. His example, he says, you're not supposed to just eat for pleasure. You're supposed to eat for health. And actually, even if you're eating for health, that's not the ultimate being Oved Hashem. What one is supposed to do is eat healthily because it will give me the capacity and the discipline to work for God. And the way in which the goal there is to create a physically, socially, and intellectually healthy society with which we can recognize the divine presence. So these are three very different, psychologically different ways of serving God. One is to negate my will, one is to develop relationship through spirituality, and one is to channel my physical and mental self towards the betterment of society and the world. I would say that to be a Jew means to serve God, whether by submitting our will to God's, trying to connect to God's divine spirit, or channeling our physical capacity towards the perfection of a godly world. Our challenge and mission is to choose a path that will strengthen the Spirit of God in our individual and communal lives. As we together approach the Yamim Noraim, may we be successful at cultivating within ourselves the spirit of an inspired Oved Hashem, a Jew living in the service of God. Thank you.